Arrogance is the armor of the untested. The courtroom was quiet save for the occasional scribble of a pen or the creak of a worn leather chair. In the front row, a young woman with a legal pad full of color-coded notes clicked her pen 3 times before leaning back in her seat. Jessica Mercer was prepared, maybe even over-prepared. But that's how she'd gotten through law school, not with charm, not with money, not with connections, but with sheer, grinding preparation. She was dressed in sharply navy blue blazer, her late mother's pearl earrings, and a pair of low heels that made her look professional but not stuffy. She had a trial today, a real one. No mock court, no judge with a grading rubric, real people, real stakes. And, as far as she was concerned, an easy win. The defendant looked like he belonged in a VA waiting room, not in a courtroom. He sat at the defense table, elbows resting lightly on the wood, wearing an old sport coat that might have been stylish some time around the Reagan administration. His white hair was combed neatly, and wire-framed glasses perched low on his nose. He was writing something. Slowly, methodically, with an actual fountain pen, as if the world hadn't moved on. Randy Pemberton. That was his name. She'd only skimmed his background. A couple mentions of military service, some rambling about constitutional rights and obscure statutes. He'd filed to defend himself pro se, which made her job even easier. No seasoned attorney to play games, no clever legal jujitsu, just her, a rising star, against a relic who didn't know when to let go of the past. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Randy did too, slower than the rest, his hand briefly steadying the table as he rose. He didn't look at Jessica. He hadn't looked at her at all, actually. Not when she entered, not when she passed him in the hallway, not even when they'd shared the same elevator earlier that morning. It was as if he saw through her, as if she didn't matter. Jessica took that personally. She had worked too hard to be overlooked. If he wanted to treat her like some rookie, he'd learn quickly that she wasn't just fresh out of law school. She was top of her class, captain of her mock trial team, and had interned under one of the most aggressive prosecutors in the state. This wasn't arrogance. It was readiness. Still, when she glanced over at him now, sitting so calmly while the courtroom came alive around them, something in her stomach shifted. Just a flicker, like a draft she couldn't trace. The clerk read the charges. Obstruction, unlawful interference with a police investigation, and failure to comply with a lawful order. Straightforward enough. The case file said Pemberton had inserted himself into a traffic stop, started filming, questioning the officer, escalating the situation until it got physical. He'd been arrested, charged, and refused a public defender. Jessica's opening statement was scheduled for the morning, but today was a preliminary hearing, a chance for both sides to present basic facts, establish credibility, and, most importantly, for her to show the court that she knew how to handle herself. The judge called them to the bench. Jessica stood with purpose, grabbing her legal pad and approaching with confidence. Randy rose too, slow but unbothered. There was a slight limp to his step, like a man who'd stopped apologizing for time's toll on his body. He didn't bring notes. Just that pen, just that face. "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Albright said, peering over his glasses. "You are still electing to represent yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," Randy replied, voice calm and deep like gravel polished smooth over years. "I am competent, and I understand the implications." Jessica bit the inside of her cheek. The tone, the poise. It wasn't how most self-representing defendants spoke. It wasn't defensive or desperate. It was practiced. The judge nodded. "Very well. Ms. Mercer, you may proceed with your brief." She launched into it. Her voice was firm, modulated and clear. She outlined the facts, cited precedent, and emphasized public safety and accountability. She gestured just enough to seem natural but not theatrical. She'd rehearsed it a dozen times in front of her bathroom mirror. When she finished, the judge turned to Randy. "And your response?" Randy didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or object or even reference any notes. Instead, he looked at the judge like they were the only two people in the room. "The prosecution presents a compelling sequence of events," he said. "But a sequence without context is not truth. It is theater, and today I am not here to perform." Jessica blinked. "Theater? I will show," he continued, "that what the officer deemed interference was, in fact, a lawful exercise of civic responsibility, that the traffic stop in question violated multiple procedural safeguards, and that, in my capacity as a citizen, and, once upon a time, a drafter of the very military justice code this court is built upon, I acted not in contempt of the law, but in defense of it." That last line made the room shift, subtle, like a ripple in a still pond. The judge leaned forward. "You helped draft the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" Randy finally turned toward Jessica, his eyes sharp, steel pool, unflinching. Met hers. "Yes, Your Honor, as part of the 1974 Joint Revision Task Force. My annotations on Articles 15, 32, and 138 are still referenced in military legal training to this day." Jessica's throat tightened. No way. No way. She'd studied those articles. She knew those annotations. She'd quoted them in class, debated them in seminars. Whoever R. Pemberton was, he was that. Pemberton? The judge nodded slowly, then looked at Jessica. "Mercer, any objections to continuing with the hearing?" She hesitated, just for a second, but the damage was done. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that draws breath away. She forced a smile. "None, Your Honor." And then Randy turned back toward the bench, adjusted his glasses, and sat down. The click of his pen echoed like a gabble. What had begun as a warm-up hearing just became something else entirely. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with low chatter. Reporters from local papers leaned against the marble walls, pretending not to watch. A court officer stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning the corridor with the patience of someone who'd seen too many young attorneys walk in like sharks and crawl out like minnows. Jessica Mercer emerged from the double doors in a brisk stride, heading toward the restroom, though, in truth, she didn't need to go. She just needed a mirror. Inside, she dropped her case file on the narrow ledge and stared at her reflection. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders drawn. She reached for a paper towel, ran it under cold water, and dabbed at the back of her neck. That name, R. Pemberton, was etched into the corner of every JAG study guide she'd ever used. And the annotations? She'd cited them in her final research paper. Her professor, a retired colonel with a voice like a buzzsaw, had called them the gold standard. The man sitting across from her in court wasn't some outdated windbag. He was the ghost of her textbooks. A contributor to the very system she thought she understood better than anyone in that room. Jessica leaned closer to the mirror. Her expression didn't betray anything. But inside, her certainty had cracked. Not broken. Not yet. But cracked. She wasn't going to let him win. As she returned to the courtroom, she passed by Randy, who sat alone on the bench outside, flipping through a worn, leather-bound notebook, the kind of thing professors carried, not defendants. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. There was no smugness, no self-satisfaction, just that same unshakable calm. Jessica sat down at her table and began flipping through the officer's report again. Officer Lanning's body cam footage had captured the incident, and she'd reviewed it more than once. She knew Randy had asked pointed questions, knew he'd recorded the entire stop on his own phone. What she hadn't considered, what no one had considered, was why he'd done it. And now the question felt heavier. The judge re-entered. Everyone rose. "We'll continue with witness testimony," Judge Albright said. "Prosecution, call your first." Jessica stood. "The people, call Officer Drew Lanning." A tall, square-jawed man in a neatly pressed uniform walked to the stand, nodding at Jessica as he passed. He moved like someone trained to look competent, confident. He raised his right hand, swore in, and took a seat. Jessica approached, heels measured against the wooden floor. "Oh, Officer Lanning," she began, "on the morning of July 16th, can you walk us through the events leading to Mr. Pemberton's arrest?" Lanning nodded. At approximately 9:42 a.m., I initiated a traffic stop on Sycamore Street for a black sedan that had failed to yield at a pedestrian crosswalk. Vehicle matched the plate of a prior citation. As I approached the vehicle, I began my standard procedure. About 2 minutes in, the defendant, he gestured toward Randy, intervened. He approached from the sidewalk, began filming and questioning my conduct. "Did he comply with your instructions?" "No, I told him to stay back. He kept inching closer, citing laws I was unfamiliar with, asking about jurisdiction and probable cause. He was confrontational." Jessica nodded. "Did you feel that his behavior obstructed your ability to perform your duty?" "Yes, ma'am. It distracted both me and the driver, prolonged the stop, and escalated the situation. I made the decision to place Mr. Pemberton under arrest. And when you attempted to detain him, he resisted, not violently, but verbally, argued about Fourth Amendment rights, jurisdictional boundaries, filming authority. Legal jargon, frankly. Took a few minutes before I got the cuffs on." Jessica glanced at the jury. "Was anyone else harmed?" "No, but the tension was rising. He created a situation where people started gathering, a few onlookers, some with phones. It could have escalated quickly." "Thank you, officer." She turned toward Randy. "Your witness." Randy stood. He moved slowly, deliberately. No papers, no laptop, just that notebook in his left hand. "Officer Lanning," he began, voice low but steady, "you mentioned I was confrontational." "That's correct." "Did I raise my voice?" "No, but your tone—" "Tone, understood. Did I threaten you in any way?" Lanning shifted slightly. "You didn't use threatening language." "Would I physically advance on you?" "Did I touch you? Step inside your perimeter?" "No, but you were provoking." "Provoking?" Randy repeated. "By asking questions?" "You were undermining my authority." "Let's explore that. Did you inform the driver of their right to remain silent?" "She wasn't under arrest." "But you were questioning her, yes?" Lanning hesitated. "I asked for her license and registration. Routine." Randy nodded. "Do you recall the words I used when I approached?" Lanning exhaled. "You said, 'Is this a voluntary stop, officer, or are you detaining her?' Correct? And you replied, 'I told you it was none of your business.' And then you kept asking questions about case law, about your right to observe." Randy stepped closer, still behind the line allowed for questioning. "Did I cite Turner v. Driver, 5th Circuit, 2017? "I believe so." "Did I cite Glick v. Cuniff, 1st Circuit, 2011? "You did." "Both affirm the right of citizens to film public officials in public spaces, correct?" Lanning didn't answer right away. Randy turned to the judge. "Permission to treat the witness as hostile?" "Second." "Granted," the judge said, slightly surprised. Randy looked back at Lanning. "You're a 10-year veteran of the force, are you not?" "Yes." "And in those 10 years, how many times have you been recorded during a stop?" Lanning hesitated again. "Several. It's common. So what made this time different?" Lanning bristled. "You weren't just recording, you were interfering. You were citing laws, trying to correct me." "Trying to correct or holding accountable?" Lanning's jaw tightened. "Same difference." "The Constitution." Randy let that hang in the air. He turned back to his seat, but before sitting, he asked one final question. "Officer Lanning, were you aware at the time that the sidewalk I stood on, where I filmed and asked questions, was public property, and my distance from the vehicle met the 10-foot guideline your own department recommends in its training manual?" Lanning didn't answer. No further questions. Jessica watched Randy return to his seat with the same slow, quiet grace he'd walked in with, not triumphant, just present, like he'd been there before. like he'd seen bigger rooms than this one, harder fights than this one. She stared down at her notes. Her cross-examination strategy evaporated. He had just dismantled the officer's authority, not by yelling, not by lawyering hard, but by knowing, by remembering. The judge called for recess. As the room emptied, Jessica stayed seated, her mind spinning. Randy gathered his notebook, adjusted his coat, and as he walked past her table, he paused. "You have talent," he said softly. "Don't waste it on certainty. Certainty is brittle." Then he walked away. By the time court resumed that afternoon, something had shifted, not in the evidence, not in the paperwork, not in the law, but in the room. There was a different energy to it now, like the air had been stirred up by something old that had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Reporters returned to their seats with more focused eyes, their pens twitching not with routine but anticipation. The crowd was larger, too. Word had spread. Jessica sat quietly at the prosecution table, a legal pad before her that was now filled more with questions than statements. She wasn't used to uncertainty, not in court. Her strategy had been crisp, elegant, bulletproof. But Randy Pemberton didn't fight like most people. He didn't argue for effect. He made you question the very ground your argument stood on. When the judge returned and the courtroom stood, Jessica noticed Randy remained seated a moment longer than the others. Not out of defiance, but out of age. He pushed himself up with care, but he did rise. And as he did, Jessica noticed again that subtle dignity in his posture, as though his spine had memorized the weight of decades spent standing for something far more demanding than a single courtroom's verdict. "Defense," Judge Albright said. "You may now present your first witness." Randy stood without haste. "I would like to call Ms. Layla Boone to the stand." A quiet murmur fluttered through the seats. Jessica glanced at her notes. Boone. That name hadn't appeared in the original witness list. She leaned toward the clerk, whispering, "Was this witness cleared?" The clerk nodded. "Added this morning. Notification was sent." Jessica frowned. Her phone had been off. A woman in her mid-30s entered from the gallery, conservative blazer, long hair pinned neatly back. She had the steady eyes of someone who'd sat on both sides of a conference table and learned not to flinch first. As she swore in and sat, Jessica tried to read her, no rings, professional demeanor, a file folder in her lap. But the thing that struck her most was the way she looked at Randy. Respect, but not awe. The kind of look people reserve for mentors who once held them accountable. Randy approached the witness stand with that same deliberate grace. "Ms. Boone," he began, "would you please state your occupation for the record?" "I'm the Director of Policy Review and Legal Affairs for the California Veterans Legal Resource Center." "And your relationship to me?" "You were my professor, sir, at Hastings Law, military law and federal procedure. And during your time in my class, were you aware of my prior role in federal code restructuring?" "Yes." "You never spoke of it yourself, but your name was in our required reading." Randy nodded once. "Did I ever instruct you on how to interrupt a police officer mid-traffic stop?" "No, sir." "Did I ever endorse unlawful interference with law enforcement?" "Never." Randy turned slightly toward the jury. "What did I teach you about the role of citizens in the observation of state power?" Layla's voice became sharper, almost rehearsed. "That constitutional rights are not suspended in public spaces, that lawful observation is not obstruction, and that silence in the face of improper authority is complicity. And do you believe I violated those teachings?" "No," she said firmly. "You lived them." Jessica leaned forward, watching the jurors. One was nodding faintly. Another scribbled something on his notepad. Randy continued, "You've reviewed the footage from my incident?" "Yes, sir." "In your professional opinion, what did you observe?" Layla opened her folder. "I saw a man recording from an appropriate distance, citing applicable case law, asking questions calmly. When told to step back, he complied. When threatened with arrest, he requested clarification. No physical obstruction occurred. No intimidation, just presence, legal presence. Obstruction? Done. Disorderly conduct? Not by any definition I've ever enforced. Jessica stood. Objection, opinion being presented as fact. The judge glanced at her. Overruled. Expert witness testimony. Jessica sank back, teeth clenched. Boone had credibility. Too much. Randy approached the edge of the jury box. He didn't raise his voice, didn't puff out his chest. He simply stood there, quiet. "Do we want a nation where it is illegal to ask questions?" he said, softly. "Where recording the execution of public power is an offense? We built this country on dissent. We kept it honest with questions. We strengthened it with accountability." He turned to the judge. "No further questions." Jessica stood slowly. She couldn't let this be a free run. "Ms. Boone," she began, "have you ever served in law enforcement?" "So your experience is in policy review, not field work." "Correct. And in your review of this footage, you observed what you personally interpreted as calm behavior, but could another viewer interpret it differently? Only if they disregard the law." Jessica kept her face neutral. "Boone was good. Damn good. Are you aware of the challenges officers face in the field? The stress? The split-second decisions?" "Yes. That's why training exists. To prepare them for lawful observation and public scrutiny." Jessica exhaled. No further questions. Layla stepped down. As she passed Randy, she touched his arm gently, then returned to the gallery. The judge called for a brief recess. Jessica stepped outside. The hallway was louder now. People whispered as she passed. She caught her name. She caught Randy's too. Someone mentioned the phrase, "constitutional legend." Someone else asked where they could read his articles. She kept walking, down the hallway, past the water fountain, and into the stairwell, where she could finally let the silence wrap around her. For the first time in her short career, she didn't know how this would end. Not because the facts had changed, not because the law was any different, but because she hadn't understood the weight of the man sitting at that defense table. She hadn't known what legacy smelled like, or how quietly it could walk. From behind her, the door creaked open. It was Randy. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, not too close. His presence was different outside the courtroom, less judicial, more human. "I've read your opening statement," he said finally. "You have the voice, but it's still searching for its anchor." Jessica crossed her arms. "You're trying to teach me now?" He smiled faintly. "No, just observing. Like you're learning to do." She turned to face him. "He could have had a lawyer, a top-tier team. You chose to do this alone. And not alone. Not in the ways that matter. And what do you get out of this? A wind? Some headline about the old vet who out-argued the rookie?" Randy looked at her. "I give the reminder that not every battle is fought to win. Some are fought to be seen." Then he turned and walked away, his cane tapping gently on the concrete. Jessica didn't follow. Not yet. But something inside her had already started to move. Something that wasn't pride or competition or the need to be the best. Something closer to understanding. Something much harder to defend against. The courtroom felt more like a lecture hall than a battleground now, except the stakes were far higher than grades. Jessica returned to her seat with her confidence guarded, not shattered, but tempered, like steel after flame. Randy Pemberton sat calmly at the defense table, hands folded over his notebook. There was no gloating in his demeanor, no smugness. If anything, he looked still, the kind of stillness that comes after surviving storms, not avoiding them. The judge entered, and the room rose as one. Everyone had a sense now that this was not a routine misdemeanor trial anymore. This had become something else. A civic reckoning. A legal story with veins of history running through it. Even the stenographer's eyes flicked more often toward the defendant. "Defense?" Judge Albright said. "You may call your next witness." Randy stood. "Your Honor, I would like to recall myself to the stand for direct examination." A pause. The judge arched a brow. Proceed. Jessica folded her arms. Unusual, but not impermissible, and given who he was, the court wasn't going to deny him. Randy walked slowly to the witness stand, took the oath without ceremony, and settled into the chair like it was an old friend. He began before the judge could prompt him. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, eyes on the jury. "I'm not telling it to earn sympathy. I'm telling it because law is not made in books. It is made in people." Jessica leaned forward. He wasn't reading from notes. This was off book. "I enlisted in 1969. Navy. Vietnam was heating, but I had a different role. They wanted my brain more than my body. I was sent to JAG Corps school. I didn't see combat, but I saw what war did to the men who came home. The rules of engagement were clear overseas, but murky back home. I watched as veterans were prosecuted under vague articles that hadn't been revised since Korea. I asked questions, too many apparently, so they assigned me to a drafting group. The jury was completely silent. Even the usual fidgeters sat still. We rewrote sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, not to make it easier to prosecute, but to make it harder to abuse. We added specificity, timelines, appeal windows, rights advisements. Not glamorous work, but necessary. He glanced briefly at Jessica. "And when I left service, I kept teaching not to create more lawyers, to create better ones." He paused, eyes back to the jury. "On the day I was arrested, I saw something I'd seen before, an officer escalating a routine stop. I didn't shout. I didn't interfere physically. I asked a question, and for that, I was handcuffed." He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence did the shouting. Jessica rose. "Your Honor, may I begin cross-examination?" The judge nodded. He approached the stand slowly. "Mr. Pemberton," she began, "I don't dispute your history, but legacy doesn't exempt someone from the law. Isn't that correct?" "Correct," he replied without hesitation. "But understanding the law does provide a lens through which we interpret it." Jessica paced lightly, her heels clicking. "You said you were recording a traffic stop. Why?" "Because I saw a woman in a vehicle visibly distressed, and I believe in watching power when it acts in public." "You could have filed a complaint after the fact and risked the footage being suppressed or the interaction being misrepresented?" "No." "You don't believe that intervening, asking questions, could escalate a situation?" "I believe silence allows abuse to breathe. Questions, when calm and loving, are a disinfectant." Jessica pressed. "But to that officer, weren't your questions a threat to his authority?" Randy tilted his head slightly. "If his authority crumbles under lawful scrutiny, it was never authority. It was control." Jessica blinked. The jury murmured. She caught herself. No further questions. As Randy stepped down, Jessica sat and stared at her notes. But they didn't matter anymore. Not in the way they once did. This wasn't a case about obstruction. It's a case about who gets to define accountability. The prosecution had one last card. She had debated using it, but now it felt inevitable. "Your Honor," she said, "the state calls Officer Karen Rosenthal." A woman in uniform stepped through the door. Short-cropped hair, stern eyes, her posture rigid with professionalism. She approached the stand and swore in with mechanical precision. Jessica began carefully. "Officer Rosenthal, where do you serve?" "Internal Affairs, Los Angeles Division." "Did you review the footage and reports regarding Officer Lanning's conduct the day Mr. Pemberton was arrested?" "I did." Jessica hesitated. "And what were your findings?" The officer didn't glance at Randy. She kept her eyes forward. The stop was procedurally questionable. The suspect vehicle did not match the profile of any active warrant. Officer Lanning did not follow de-escalation protocol and used subjective language in his report. The decision to arrest Mr. Pemberton appears retaliatory. A ripple shot through the courtroom. Jessica steadied herself. "Retaliatory?" "Yes. There's no indication Mr. Pemberton posed a physical threat or obstructed the investigation materially. His arrest occurred only after he invoked legal precedent aloud. Your recommendation? Officer Lanning is currently under administrative review, suspension likely. Jessica nodded. No further questions. Randy didn't rise. He didn't need to. The witness had spoken for him. And in that moment, the story changed again. When Officer Rosenthal stepped down, the room felt altered. The prosecution had just undermined itself. The judge looked toward Jessica. Counsel, do you have any further witnesses? She shook her head slowly. No, Your Honor. Defense? Randy stood. No more witnesses, but I request to make a closing statement directly. The judge gave a nod. Randy walked to the center of the room and paused. This time, there was no defense table to lean on, no notebook, just him. There's a line between defiance and duty, he said, between chaos and conscience. On the day I was arrested, I didn't act as a rebel, I acted as a citizen, a witness. He turned slightly, his voice even. If asking a question becomes a threat, then we must ask who gave the question that power. If filming authority is seen as antagonism, then we must ask what that authority fears being seen. He looked toward Jessica. I do not fault the prosecution. She has honored her role. She's played her part with integrity. Then he turned to the jury. But this case is not about me. It's not about a retired JAG officer with opinions and a camera. It's about you. The right to watch. The right to ask. The right to hold. A beat of silence. I ask only that you remember one thing. The law is not fragile, but liberty is. He sat down, and for the first time, even the judge didn't speak, because the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of questions, and the people finally ready to ask them. The next morning, the courthouse was quieter than usual, but it wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence that held its breath. Journalists filled the benches early, whispering, checking their angles. Law students from the nearby university had packed the rear gallery. Even the bailiffs seemed more alert. Everyone had felt the momentum shift. Everyone sensed that something unusual had crept into the halls of justice. A man who refused to yell but could still shake the walls. Jessica Mercer arrived earlier than usual, coffee in hand but untouched. She walked straight past the media line without acknowledging them, her mind already somewhere deep in closing arguments. She hadn't slept well, not because she thought she would lose, but because she now understood what a loss would mean. This wasn't just about obstruction charges anymore. It was about whether the justice system was large enough to admit it had misunderstood someone. She sat at the prosecution table, flipping through her notes not to find something new, but to remind herself of what was still worth saying. Randy Pemberton was already seated across the aisle, dressed in the same brown blazer, the same old notebook folded open before him. No rustling, no rehearsing, just quiet stillness. Again, the judge entered. Good morning. The court is in session. We'll now proceed to closing arguments. Jessica rose. She didn't bother with theatrics, not today. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began. This case began with a question, a simple one. Did a man overstep the boundaries of lawful behavior during a traffic stop? She looked at them directly, one by one. The prosecution has shown you video, policy, and officer testimony to suggest that, yes, he crossed a line, that his presence interfered with an officer's ability to perform his duty. She paused. No one shifted. They were listening. But in the course of this trial, she continued, you've also seen that sometimes the line itself deserves to be questioned. You've heard from an internal affairs officer who confirmed that procedures were broken. You've seen a defendant who has not denied his actions but invited you to examine their purpose. She inhaled. Mr. Pemberton is not above the law. No one is. But maybe he wasn't beneath its protection either. That's where your duty begins. She nodded and sat down. No dramatic finish, just truth. She hoped that would be enough. The judge turned. "Mr. Pemberton, you're closing." Randy didn't stand right away. He closed his notebook carefully, then rose slowly and walked toward the center of the room. His cane tapped softly on the floor as he moved. He looked smaller than he had a week ago, older, but not weaker. "I am not a lawyer," he began. "Not anymore. And I'm not a rebel. Never was." He took a moment. "I am, however, someone who remembers the sound of silence when a man begged to be seen. I remember that sound better than I remember most things. And when I stood on that sidewalk last July, I recognized that sound again." He looked at the jury. "See that grinder, the one you saw in the footage? She was crying, not shouting, not arguing, crying. And the officer did not ask why. He asked for her papers." He stepped forward. They did not interfere. I reminded a uniform that it answers to a constitution." He turned toward Jessica and gave a respectful nod before continuing. "And I reminded myself, too, because it had been too long since I raised my voice, not in anger but in defense." He tapped his cane once. "Increased depression. Don't absolve me. I don't need that. But don't forget me either. Not because I matter, but because the next person won't have a name in your textbooks. The next one will just be another voice that gets brushed aside. And I want you to ask yourselves something." He leaned slightly on the cane, his eyes scanning the jurors. "What happens when the law is used not to protect, but to prevent being questioned?" Then he turned and walked slowly back to his seat. The judge's voice was almost reverent. "The jury will now deliberate." The jurors rose and filed out, the heavy wooden door shutting behind them with a deep click. The room exhaled. Jessica didn't move. Neither did Randy. They both remained seated as if in some quiet truce. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and then the door opened. A hush fell again. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. The foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Randolph Pemberton, not guilty." A sound broke in the gallery, just one sharp breath from someone who'd clearly been holding it. The rest was silence. Randy did not react, not at first, and slowly nodded. Jessica closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. Relief wasn't the right word. It was something deeper, something humbling. The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Pemberton, you are free to go." The courtroom slowly began to shift, people gathering belongings, murmurs building again. The air, which had been charged, now loosened. Jessica rose and approached Randy. She extended her hand. "I underestimated you," she said. Randy looked at her hand, then shook it. His grip was surprisingly strong. "No, you measured me, then recalibrated. That's the job." She smiled faintly. "Will you go back to teaching?" He shook his head. "No, I'll go back to watching. There's a lot to see these days." Before he left, he turned one last time and added, "Keep asking the right questions, Ms. Mercer, even when the answers come too late." Then he walked out, leaving his notebook behind on the table. Jessica picked it up, intending to return it, but paused. On the first page, in neat script, was a quote. "Law, when written by memory instead of fear, becomes justice." He didn't recognize the source. Maybe it was his. Maybe it didn't matter. She ran her fingers over the worn leather, then clutched it to her chest as if it might teach her something through osmosis. Outside, the sun was high over the courthouse. And inside, something rare had just happened. Not a victory, a televic event. 2 weeks after the trial, the courthouse was back to its usual rhythm. The buzz had faded, reporters moved on to other headlines, the legal community returned to its familiar rituals, and for most people in town the case of State v. Pemberton became another footnote in a season of news. But for those who had been, not as noise, but as a frequency you could only hear if you were still enough, Jessica Mercer sat at a coffee shop near the university campus. Her suit jacket was folded beside her, sleeves rolled up, her fingers wrapped around a cup that had gone cold an hour ago. She wasn't thinking about law school anymore. Not the rankings, not the clerkships. She was thinking about Randy's notebook. It sat open on the table in front of her. She had read every page. There were no case strategies, no witty one-liners, no dramatic speeches sketched out. Just fragments of thoughts, quotes, observations, a list of names of people he defended, helped, challenged. Some were circled, some were underlined. Next to one he'd written, "Didn't win, but we stood." Jessica ran her finger across that line again. She didn't know it yet, but that notebook would eventually sit in a display case at Hastings Law. Students would read those scribbled notes with reverence, unaware that they were never written for anyone but Randy himself. The chime above the coffee shop door rang. Jessica didn't look up right away, not until she heard a familiar cane tap on the hardwood floor. Randy Pemberton stood in front of her table, wearing the same brown blazer, the same steady expression. Jessica smiled. "I didn't expect you," she said, rising to greet him. "I didn't expect a phone call from a prosecutor," Randy said, settling into the chair across from her. "Especially one who beat herself up for 2 days before dialing." "I didn't beat myself up," she said. Then, after a pause, "Okay." "I did." He chuckled softly. "Means you still care. Good. That's rare currency." She closed the notebook. "I wanted to ask you something." "Go on." "You didn't fight for the verdict, did you?" He tilted his head. "You fought for the record?" Randy nodded once, slowly. "The verdict ends the case. The record lives longer." She thought about that, then leaned in. "There's going to be a panel next month on First Amendment law, civil accountability. The university's hosting it. I want you there." "I'm not a spectacle," Randy said gently. "You're a precedent." He met her eyes. "I'll think about it." They drank in silence for a few minutes, watching students pass by through the windows. Jessica broke the quiet. "I knew the jury was going to acquit." "Didn't you?" "No," Randy said. "But I knew they wanted to. I gave them permission." "Now, by not asking for it." Jessica laughed under her breath. "You do that a lot, don't you? Talk in riddles." "I'm old. I've earned the right to be cryptic." They sat a while longer. When Randy finally stood to leave, Jessica did too. She held out the notebook. "You forgot this." He pushed it back toward her. "No, I left it." "I can't keep this," she said. "You're not keeping it," Randy replied. "You're continuing it." She looked down at the worn leather, heart racing a little at the implication. "You're passing the torch?" He shook his head. "No, just giving you a better lantern." They said goodbye at the door. Randy tipped an invisible hat and walked off slowly, disappearing into the sidewalk crowd like a quiet footnote that would one day become the headline. A month later, Randy sat at the back of a lecture hall. He hadn't planned to come. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. But something told him to go. Curiosity, maybe, or pride. Jessica stood at the podium, speaking not with force, but with precision. "There is a difference," she told the room, "between disorder and discomfort. We often mistake the latter for the former because it's easier to silence discomfort than to examine its cause." The audience leaned in, and yet our legal system was designed to hold discomfort, not to run from it. In that spirit, let me tell you about a man named Randy Pemberton. Randy listened as she told his story, not to glorify, but to ground, to remind people that silence, when chosen, is a tool. And when broken for the right reason, it becomes justice with a pulse. He didn't stay to the end. He left as quietly as he came. Months passed. Summer turned to fall, and one evening, Jessica stood at a dedication event in the lobby of the courthouse. A new plaque had been installed beneath a framed photo. It showed a courtroom, a judge, a young prosecutor, and an old man standing beside her. The caption read, "Scholar of Randolph Pemberton, veteran, scholar, and defender of the question." Jessica smiled as people passed by, stopping to read. Some took pictures, others just paused in silent respect. The legacy was there now, not in a verdict, not in applause, but in the way people paused and asked themselves what they might stand for when no one was watching. Randy never returned to the courtroom again. But his story did. Every time someone raised their hand, every time someone said, "Wait," every time someone remembered that watching is not the same as interfering, and asking is not the same as defying, is sometimes the very thing that keeps the system honest. On the bed, equal free.